depending on when you are seeing this. I am Sandy Shellis, and I have a guest today named Frank Rotering. Frank is super interesting. I'll tell you, we've been going back and forth for the last, right, Frank, couple of months, trying to get this good schedule, which is usually completely my fault, but I am so happy that you are with us. Frank is an interesting guy. Frank is an economics background and an author, but he was a trainer, and he trained all over the world as a trainer, is software training. And what got him and woke him up was something he saw by David Suzuki, which I think, we all have that moment of what inspired us, what woke us up, what said, gave us that jar that said, oh my gosh, shit's hitting the fan. So Frank, welcome to Environmental Coffee House, and take it from there. Hi.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Sandy. Just to go on with the David Suzuki thing, in fact, like I said, like you said, I went to university based on what Suzuki said about economics being ecologically ignorant. And I had a very interesting experience at university. Aside from learning the basics of standard economics, one day a professor and I were talking after class, and I was sort of waving my arms, telling him progressive ideas I had, and he stopped me cold by saying, Frank, where's your model? Where are your equations? Where's your theory? And I realized, this was my real shock, my initial real shock in life, was that as a progressive person, I had no economic theory. I couldn't counter what he was saying about trade, about anything, because I had no theory. And I looked around very carefully, Ruskin, Schumacher, many others, and looking for an alternative theory that we progressives could call our own, could not find it. And so I decided to develop my own. That took about 15 years. And the final result is what's called the Economics of Needs and Limits, or ENL. And it is an alternative to standard economics for guiding a sustainable society. Okay? So that's the book. I've written another one as well, but that's obsolete. But this book, I'm about to produce a third or a fourth edition of it. It should be out in 2022. Okay?
2022. All right.
Yeah, well, I've got another book coming out next year.
Oh, great.
Called Ecological Survival, and then a fourth edition to my economics book a year after that. So that's the plan.
Okay.
The other major shock in my life, Sandy, came more recently in 2016. At that point, I thought I understood this crisis, the ecological crisis, and I sat down to write a book about it titled Strategy for Economic Survival. So again, this is mid-2016. And I thought I should do my due diligence on the ecological crisis before I wrote this book. I consider myself a social thinker, economics, politics, not a scientific thinker. So I trusted the scientists to tell me the truth and to tell me what was going on. So I did that. I carefully looked at a bunch of books, videos, Peter Wadhams and all that, and discovered two things that I've been wrong about. I had assumed that if we reduced our impact, our ecological impact, that would suffice to stop this crisis and bring us back to sustainability. And especially Peter Wadhams taught me that I was wrong, that things had gone so far awry in the Arctic, especially, of course, which is Peter's specialty, that it was not enough simply to reduce our impact. We actually had to remove greenhouse gases from the atmosphere to restore a safe environment. So that was one shock, that simply reducing our impact wasn't enough. We had to actually intervene. And I'm afraid the word for that is geoengineering, which we'll talk about. Okay, so that was number one. We had to actively intervene. And secondly, I learned something that was much more distressing, And that is that the scientists I was listening to, the Michael Manns of the world, etc., were not telling the truth. They were distorting the crisis, especially the greenhouse gas crisis, which we normally call climate change. And they were framing the ecological crisis incorrectly. And really, that's what I'm going to talk about today, is that misconduct, because that was a shock to the system, Sandy, I'll tell you, because again, like most people, I put my faith implicitly in the IPCC, in well-known climate scientists. And it was a terrific shock to see that these people were not being straight with us. And in fact, if we followed their advice, this would all, of course, end in total collapse. So it is that misconduct which I am going to address today mostly. But in addition to that, I've been developing a far deeper theory, which we probably will not get into in this interview, but perhaps in the future.
Absolutely.
I also deal heavily with really what's more familiar to me, the social world. And there I deal a lot with capitalism, with power, and with the need for revolutionary change. And I'd like to then go to the first slide, which is figure 1, simplified depiction of the GHG crisis. Okay, so that's the paper that Sandy's referring to. It's not a paper really, it's a post on my website, ecologicalsurvival.org. And the man you see here is Arthur Galston, as you can tell. And Galston is, this by the way, is not from my website, it's from anyway, so that's Arthur Galston. He's a professor at Yale, or he was in the 1960s. And he's the guy who discovered or developed Agent Orange, which was, of course, thrown in huge quantities over Vietnamese forests to basically denude them and to expose Viet Cong trails. He was utterly appalled at the use of his invention. And so he petitioned his fellow scientists within the plant community and beyond. And he got a petition going, and which went to Lyndon Johnson in 1970. And Johnson, surprisingly, ended the use of Agent Orange 5 years before the Vietnam War ended in 75. So Galston set a shining example, for me at least, of what a scientist should do. Not just develop things in a safe and humane fashion, but also when that invention or development or whatever comes out into the world, that they take moral responsibility for what happens then. Galston did that, and today's scientists, and I'm particularly targeting climate scientists, are not doing that. And I'd like to prove that to you by raising a number of points, okay? So, the first one is that the scientific community has a number of organizations that have codes of ethics or conduct. And the most common one for climate scientists, at least here in North America, is the AGU, the American Geophysical Union, has tens of thousands of members. They have a code of ethics, and I'll read to you the key clause from that. There are several clauses in there relating to the environment and protecting it, but this is the key one, and I think your listener should understand what these people are saying. It's quite accurate, actually. So this is a section from their code of ethics, or code of conduct. Quote, stewardship of the earth. Members have an ethical obligation to responsibly, accurately, and clearly inform the public about natural resources, hazards, and other geoscience phenomena of importance to the well-being of Earth and society. In other words, they are taking responsibility for a sustainable atmosphere and world generally. There are many other organizations, the National Academy of Sciences, for instance, and many others I won't get into. They have similar codes of conduct, which basically tell scientists that they have to be responsible, socially responsible. And in the post we're referring to here, my summary is that the social responsibility of climate scientists are to, I'm quoting here, to clearly, fully, and accurately inform society about the crisis and its potential solutions, and to respectfully interact with the public on these issues. These are not my words. Well, these are my words, but they summarize what the scientists themselves are saying about their own responsibilities. Okay. So all I'm doing, Sandy, is holding the scientists to their own promises and commitments. Okay?
Exactly. Yes. Yes.
And what I'm saying is that with a few honorable exceptions, and I think Peter Wadhams is right near the top of that list, climate scientists have abrogated those responsibilities. And that's a big claim. I'm claiming that climate science, for the most part, is corrupt, intellectually corrupt. Okay, and I'm about to substantiate that for you. By the way, there's also, as part of their code of ethics, I missed it here, but another this is from the American Association for the Advancement of Science, one of the two major scientific organizations in your country, besides the NAS, the National Academy of Sciences.
Yes.
They state, and I'm quoting here again, citizens have every right to ask who the experts are, how they are chosen, and what the veracity of their advice is. The declaration also insists that, quote, scientists must listen and respond to criticism. Now, I just want to go about that. When I first got onto Twitter about 10 months ago, I haven't been on very long, I sent an email to Michael Mann, who, of course, is probably the most prestigious climate scientist in the world today. And he didn't like what I said, and he immediately blocked me. Scientists must listen and respond to criticism. American Association for the Advancement of Science. So, Michael Mann, where are you listening to my criticism? You don't want to hear it. Okay. But that's misconduct, according to your own codes. Wow. So, that's a lot of big talk. Let me now get down to the nitty-gritty. Okay, I have three accusations. Are you ready? I have three accusations against climate science that I'd like to get into. But before I go doing that, I'd like to emphasize that I am not critical of climate science overall, okay? I fully recognize that they have insisted correctly on the reality and gravity of the climate crisis, okay? That they have courageously resisted the deniers, and that they've done some wonderful and very dangerous and difficult research to prove to us what's going on. So on these matters, I'm fully supportive of climate science. But there are other things which lead us to develop policy, to act, which I believe have been corrupted. And that's what I'm going to get into right now. So my first accusation is disorienting society about the crisis itself. Okay? So three things there. Number one is the name of the crisis. Okay? And here I'd like you to put up that first slide, if you don't mind, Sandy. It's called Figure 1, Simplified Depiction of the GHG Crisis. Can we put that up? That's it. Thank you. Okay. So again, this is a simplification, a rather drastic one. Okay, so remember now that climate scientists, the IPCC, etc., call this crisis climate change. There's variations of that on, of course, climate crisis and all this climate weirding. If you're the Guardian, then it's global heating and all that. But anyway, the common term is climate change. But look at this diagram. Okay, on the left, we see the elevated levels of greenhouse gases. I'm not sure you can spot that, but inside are the gases, CO2, nitrous oxide, and methane, CH4. Okay. These elevated levels have two major effects. One is global warming from the greenhouse gases, of course, reflecting the heat. And the second one is ocean acidification. This is by CO2 only. It combines with seawater, and it makes the ocean more acidic, which, of course, is extremely harmful. Global warming does two things mainly. It warms the ocean, and that has some detrimental effects, and it causes climate change within the atmosphere. So climate change is definitely part of this, but it is only part of it, and it is at the end of the causal sequence. The beginning of that sequence is those elevated greenhouse gas concentrations. Also, the ocean acidification has nothing whatsoever to do with either global warming or climate change properly defined. And by the way, that proper definition is a long-standing change in the mean and variability of key weather components. That's climate change. Right. That is a result of global warming. So to call this crisis the various detrimental effects of unsafe levels of greenhouse gases, to call that set of harmful effects climate change is simply incorrect, okay? It's also wrong to call it global warming, because again, as you can see, ocean acidification has nothing to do with the warming effects of these gases. There are two effects, warming and chemical, and that warming effect has several sub-effects, only one of which is climate change. So to me, you may differ, others may differ, but to me, the proper name from what we're talking about here is the greenhouse gas crisis, or simply the GHG crisis. It
simple
doesn't
and effective.
As nicely as climate change or global warming. Hey. Yeah,
well, but
no, it's not as
Frank,
nice. If people want to continue to use, yes, sir.
Well, climate change, ma'am. Climate change gives an opening to the deniers, to the negative forces to say, well, the climate always changes. Your term doesn't, because it's happening specifically and measured. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
that's a very good point, Sandy. I had not thought of that, so I will. I'll put that in my book. Give you credit for that. But you're right. There's no way you can mess around with unsafe levels of greenhouse gases. Okay?
Nope.
And by the way, we'll come back to this important, very important topic later on in our talk. Okay.
Okay.
So I'm still dealing. Just to go back, what am I dealing with? I'm accusing climate scientists of misconduct. Number one, by disorienting them about the crisis. And number one on that list is misnaming the crisis itself. It should, in my view, be called the greenhouse gas crisis, not climate change. Secondly, and again, we're still talking about this confusing mess they've made of this, is the term climate change versus global warming. Now, these are entirely different ideas. They're related, obviously. One leads to the other. Global warming is a cause, and climate change is an effect. But their definitions, not mine, the IPCC's, are completely different. Global warming is the warming of the Earth's surface because of elevated greenhouse gases. Climate change is what I just said. Change in the mean and variability of key weather components. Those are two discrete definitions, and any thinker, any academic, any intellectual would not conflate those, right? But climate scientists, as well as journalists and other commentators, conflate these, confuse them, meld them all the time. Sandy, I've written a book on economics, like I said, and the first thing I did was produce a glossary. You first have to know the terms you're dealing with, how you're defining them. That's the core of any body of thought. Climate scientists have not done that, and they have painfully conflated these two completely different terms. Let me head on. There's one more item in this first section. Remember, we're talking about the disorientation of the crisis, and that is the term mitigation. Now, this is an important term because the primary advice we're getting from climate scientists is that we must mitigate and adapt, right? So, what does mitigate mean? Well, if you go to the official definition, which is the IPCC's, then you'll see that it means to either decrease the sources of greenhouse gases, in other words, reduce emissions, or increase the sinks, okay, by natural or technical means, greenhouse gas removal, okay? It means both of those. check the IPCC glossary if you doubt that. But again, when you listen to climate scientists, when you watch their videos, read their books, how do they use the term mitigate? Typically, about, I'd say 70% of the time, the term is used to refer to reduced emissions alone. In other words, half of the definition. So when climate scientists tell us to mitigate and adapt, what are they telling us? Are they telling us to reduce emissions and adapt? Or are they telling us to reduce emissions and draw down the greenhouse gases and adapt? We don't know. Sandy, it's so serious. One second. It's so serious. I don't even know if the climate scientists among themselves have a common definition. I don't think they do. I think when they say mitigate and adapt, half of them don't know what the other half are talking about.
It's the double speak of climate science. It's the double speak, if you get what I'm my.
And none of this is very difficult to resolve. Okay, all you need is somebody with a clear mind and saying, "What do you mean by that? What do you mean by that? Let's define them. Let's use the terms that way." And the conversation you and I are having right now would be a lot simpler. I wouldn't have to refer to this as climate change and explain that no, it's really the greenhouse gas crisis. That we would begin with that. They're not allowing us to begin with a solid intellectual infrastructure. The words we're using, this to me as a thinker is appalling.
It's appalling. Actually, Frank, this makes a lot of sense. It does to me. And you want to know, it's interesting. I have been wrestling with this. I did a show a few weeks ago on changing climate change to a different term, but I like yours better. GHG crisis. That's what it is. Thank you. Thank you, Frank.
Okay, you're welcome. So let me just sum up then. We're done with number one, but just my sentence here in this post is, so my first accusation is that, given the intellectual muddle they have created, climate scientists have been irresponsible, inaccurate, and unclear in informing the public about the GHG crisis. So that is my first accusation about the scientific misconduct of climate scientists. So number two, Sandy, again, in my list of 3 accusations against climate scientists, is the most serious one in many ways. It's abandoning the rational goal of safe greenhouse gas concentrations. And there's a story behind that, which I've told many times on my website, but let me repeat it here. In 1992, well, let me go back even further. The IPCC was formed in 1988, okay, to examine the climate issue and to come up with reasonable responses. 2 years later, 1990, they released AR1, their first assessment report. And there they outlined crudely that we did in fact have a serious problem. 2 years later, in 1992, a major agreement was signed. So in 1992, a major international agreement was signed by an organization called the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Okay, and what it stated in Article 2, the main article in that document, was that humankind should strive for safe concentrations in the atmosphere. Nothing to do with emissions, safe concentrations. So that was written in stone, so to speak. Again, international agreement, 150 countries signed or something like that. 3 years later, something extraordinary happened, which still amazes me to this day. The IPCC released AR2, its second assessment report. And in that report, it effectively canceled or reversed what the UNFCCC had done. How did it do that? Well, this agreement said that the dangerous level of greenhouse gases corresponds with an unsafe level of greenhouse gases corresponds to dangerous interference with the climate system. Okay? So what the IPCC said in 1995 was that danger or dangerous interference is a subjective concept. It's not a scientific concept. It's up to individual policymakers in different regions because there are different conditions, different vulnerabilities, different capacities to handle things. So we can't define danger as scientists. And because danger is linked to safe concentrations, we can't talk about safe or unsafe concentrations. So all we can talk about are emissions. We cannot scientifically talk about safe concentrations. This is complete nonsense, and I refute it heavily in another post, which I link to from this one here we're talking about. Okay, so one thing I'd like your listeners to really understand is this. Emissions are additions. In other words, they're additions to current levels of concentrations. Okay, so whenever you use the word emission, you're talking about an increase in concentrations. So basically what that report in 1995 said is we're not going to talk about any concentration reductions. We're only going to talk from here on in about concentration increases. So at this point, I'd like you to put up the second slide, if you don't mind, Sandy. Figure 2, safe concentrations versus emission reductions. So take a look at this diagram, please, and notice that the vertical axis is greenhouse gas concentrations. And along the horizontal axis, we have time from now into the future. Now, what the IPCC, the path they sent us on in 1995 with their second assessment report was the upper curve, the orange curve, emissions reductions pathway. What they started to do at that time was to give policymakers emission scenarios. In other words, if you follow these policies, you'll do these emissions, you'll end up at this concentration, etc. Okay, there were 4 or 5 of these. They're called RCPs, by the way, representative concentration pathways. The lower curve is the one that is consistent with the 1992 UNFCCC convention. This is a safe concentration pathway, which takes us from where we are today to sometime in the future to a safe level. Now look at the difference between these two graphs, Sandy. Okay, the upper one is the one we're currently following.
Yeah.
And what's critical here is that the damage to people and ecosystems is not the level of these lines, but the area under the curve. It is the unsafe level of greenhouse gases over time. It's that area. So that emission reductions pathway continues indefinitely because the aim is to stabilize at 1.5 degrees, let's say 450 ppm. Mm-hmm. So that area will continue to increase indefinitely. In other words, the damage to our planet, to our lives, to our civilization will continue to accrue, to accumulate, so long as concentrations are above that horizontal axis below.
Look at that.
That is the path that we've been sent on by this report, by the IPCC, by climate science. And I think this is appalling because it leads directly and inexorably to collapse. Okay, so Sandy, we're sort of finishing up with number 2, which I think is the core of it in many ways, the abandonment of safe concentrations as the rational target for the greenhouse gas crisis. One more thing I just remembered about this. If the IPCC, thank you, if the IPCC were serious in saying that it's up to policymakers in different regions to come up with the concentration they want to strive for, then we should be getting safe concentration pathways from the IPCC as well. For instance, let's say I'm in Bangladesh and I'm concerned about CO2 going above 350 ppm. Where is the IPCC's emission scenario for 350 ppm? It doesn't exist. There are no pathways to anything except increased concentrations. So even if we take them at their word, that it's up to policymakers in various regions of the world to decide what they want to do, what concentration they want to strive for, then it's up to the IPCC as the international body guiding all this to tell us how we reach what we consider to be safe concentrations. But they don't do that. They just give us increasingly unsafe concentrations. This, again, is appalling. And nobody is screaming about it, and it drives me crazy. Why aren't we screaming?
We are now.
I've written a post about my demands for the sixth assessment report, which is coming up next year or the year after, COVID depending. But in that, we should be getting those safe concentration scenarios. Will we? Of course we won't. Never will happen. Why? And here's the core of it. This is not science. The real issue here is that the pressure comes from outside, from political and economic forces.
Of course
A safe concentration pathway, Sandy, is not consistent with economic growth, with capitalism, or with rich country lifestyles. Okay? It would be revolutionary, and climate scientists ain't revolutionary.
They can't be.
And the flow tells them
right.
They're not allowed to see. They cannot see, they won't see. But for their blindness, they're now sending us on pathways that are clearly ecocidal and that can be proven logically to be ecocidal and that are inconsistent with their own words and commitments. This is almost criminal. That's why I'm talking about scientific misconduct. Not just a slap on the wrist, you should be fired. What the hell's going on here? So,
right. And a lot of us tend to feel that just because somebody is a scientist means that everything is okay and we can just relax. But like you said, the architect of Agent Orange wasn't exactly thrilled with what happened as a result of his using of his technology. Right. Okay.
Precisely. So just to sum it up, okay, we're still dealing with these three accusations I have. This is the end of number 2. So let me wrap this up by just reading my concluding paragraph here. My second accusation is that by abandoning the rational goal of safe GHG concentrations and substituting ecocidal temperature targets, I didn't address that, by the way, climate scientists are complicit in the global warming and ocean acidification that are now devastating Earth systems. They are therefore betraying rather than serving the public. So the one thing I did forget to mention, which comes up in that statement, is that the goal of 1.5 or 2 degrees is bogus. There is no rational temperature goal. Okay, anything above about 0.1, 0.2 is deadly. The only rational goal is safe concentrations and a temperature much like pre-industrial. Okay. The other thing, by the way, is that if you actually read the IPCC reports, which I have painfully done, and especially the 1.5 report, which came out a couple of years ago, you'll see that the computer models they use and the logic they use to go from emission reductions to a certain temperature is extraordinarily uncertain. I point out in one of my posts that in that report, the word uncertain is mentioned 334 times in that one report. And that's not a big report. 334 times is uncertain, uncertainty, we're not sure about this, only a 60% chance. Nobody knows the relationship between emissions and temperatures. They're faking it. Okay, it's
pretty heavy.
It is simply an illogical target. Okay, let me move on to. We ready to move on to number 3?
Absolutely.
Accusation number 3 is the misrepresentation of geoengineering, and a lot of progressive people, a lot of concerned people, are going to shudder at the word geoengineering because it has been demonized, hasn't it? But it's really extremely simple if you use the concept of energy balance, which climate scientists, in their popular statements at least, tend to avoid completely. So here's the basic picture, and it's intentionally simplified. Okay, the sun is of course at the left, the Earth at the right. There is heat, solar energy coming in from the sun, and there is heat leaving the Earth. Okay. Prior to global warming, in other words, pre-industrial, these things were in balance. Okay, the red arrow was as thick as the green arrow, or vice versa. Heat escaping the Earth has decreased. In other words, there is now more heat coming in from the sun than going out into space. That leads to an energy imbalance, and that energy imbalance manifests itself as global warming. Now, there are only two ways to deal with this growing energy imbalance, which is about to kill us, hitting tipping points and points of no return. There's only two ways to do it, scientifically. Solar radiation management, or SRM, to block some of that heat coming in, and greenhouse gas removal, GGR, which is, of course, increasing the heat escaping the Earth and getting things back into balance. Now, this is pretty darn simple, right? More heat going in and going out, hence we have to do one of these two things or in combination. But this picture, this simple picture with this simple explanation is never presented to the public. SRM is typically portrayed as a mad scientist techno fix, or hacking
the boogeyman,
the climate or something.
Chemtrails, boogeyman.
It is being portrayed as a boogeyman. That's right.
Yeah, they need to change the name.
It's very clear that the only way to solve the GHG crisis, the greenhouse gas crisis, is with the following program, which I list here on the in this section of the post. So, number one, what do we have to do? What is the right program then? The right solution to the GHG crisis? Well, it's really straightforward, although it's always avoided. Number one, aggressively reduce emissions to slow the rise in greenhouse gas concentrations. Now, let me stop there. What does aggressive mean? It doesn't mean just clean energy. That's it to some degree. But there are three factors in any impact: consumption, population, and efficiencies. Clean, green, renewable, whatever energy is in the efficiency category. It's necessary. Also necessary are reductions, sharp reductions in the rich world in consumption. And later on, humanely, as possible socially, reductions in population. So when I say aggressive reductions in emissions, I'm not talking solely about clean energy. I'm talking primarily about reducing your consumption and my consumption. Okay? Less travel, smaller houses, smaller dogs. Okay, so that's number one, aggressively reduce emissions. Number two, massively implement greenhouse gas removal. Massively. Trillions of dollars should be spent on developing that technology and enhancing it. It's the only way. There is no other way. There's no magic bullet.
That's
There's
Peter
nothing
Wadhams
else on the planet for reducing these. You got to do it one way or the other. And number three, because that's going to take maybe 50 years. It could take us half a century to remove those unsafe greenhouse gases and reduce, let's say, CO2 from 415 to 310 or so. Wow. We are going to die, and our kids are certainly going to die well before that 50 years is out, unless we implement safely, prudently as possible, solar radiation management. Okay, that's the program. Aggressive emission reductions, massive implementation of greenhouse gas removal, and the prudent but immediate implementation of SRM. Those things cannot be separated. SRM cannot be isolated as a techno fix. It is part of this three-step program as a protective stopgap measure. That, I submit to you, is the only rational response to the greenhouse gas crisis. And what are we getting? We're basically getting one part of emission reductions, efficiencies, clean energy. The population thing, of course, that's ecofascism these days. I think there are other measures. There are other important measures, which will be in my book, Ecological Survival. But but people like Monbiot and the other people who attacked Michael Moore and Planet of the Humans basically took this one part, population, out, and again characterized that as ecofascism. It's the same kind of trick as with SRM. Isolate it from the pack and call it a mad techno fix. But again, you got to see this as a package, right? A rational response package to the greenhouse gas crisis.
Yeah.
Then you can talk rationally about these things, some of which are scary. But we have to admit, though, Sandy, this is deep shit. I mean,
Deep.
the solutions would revolutionize our society, our societies, our civilization, and our lives. And many people, for various reasons, just their own personal material interests, their own security, etc., are strongly opposed to that. And I cannot blame them. I am too. I would not like to see a revolution. It would upset my lovely life here on Gabriola. I'm very comfortable here. But if we're going to save the planet for our kids and grandkids, and for non-human species, very important, something like this has to be done. We have to understand that this growth paradigm, as you mentioned, is capitalism. It's the current economic system that we all have a stake in and we've lived with for centuries now. Governments and politicians are not going to replace capitalism or the people who rule that system.
We are. Mm-hmm.
So that's the deep shit we're hinting at here, and that's a whole other discussion. And that's the core of my new book is precisely these heavy issues of capitalism, power, social control, revolutionary change, and then a post-capitalist economic system. Again, which I have the theory for.
I'm fascinated.
That's a whole other and far deeper and more difficult discussion than this.
Yeah.
So what we've done today, I think, is just to identify that climate scientists, for their own reasons, and there's a lot of pressures on them too. I don't envy them their position because they're in a scientific field that is borders right on the capitalist realities. If they make the wrong move, that bear, capitalism, shakes, and there are problems.
Well, yeah, I worked in academia. I was an academic administrator for 20 years. I know the system. It's a small city. Plus, your sponsored program money comes from places, and climate scientists that are sponsored have to walk a thin line. Precisely.
So we have to sympathize with those people.
Yes.
But they are in fact telling us lies. They are in fact distorting the crisis. They are, in fact, leading us to possible extinction. So I'm sorry for the climate scientists, but they have to come around or get out of the way.
But your motivation is good. You're motivated by something more than just yourself.
I'm motivated by humankind and the natural world, to be honest with you. I'm motivated by my species and this beautiful world that we live in, that has been destroyed basically during my lifetime, because this is one of the great shames of my life. Ecological overshoot, the violation of global environmental limits, happened around 1950. I was born in 1948. So I've lived pretty well my whole life in this overshoot condition and have been, to some degree, as a rich person, first in Holland, now in Canada, I've been complicit in this overconsumption and this destruction. And it tears at me. But that's the way life is. Let me just finish this post, if you don't mind, my concluding comments. Just going back to the American Geophysical Union and these various scientific organizations that have codes of conduct. All those codes relate to individual behavior. None of them relate to group behavior. So if you're a scientist and you're torturing rats in your lab, you will, if you're caught, you will be disciplined. That is scientific misconduct. But if you are complicit through your lies and deceptions in global warming, and 3 billion animals in Australia either die or are displaced, then you don't feel that at all. There is no discipline for you. So my main lesson here is, my main conclusion is that if climate scientists want to escape this capitalist growth trap they're in and actually serve the people, you and me, then what they have to do is they have to update these codes of conduct to include group behavior. And the American Geophysical Union has to start telling its scientists, its climate scientists, that what they are telling the people is wrong and ecocidal. In other words, the field has to be disciplined. Today, that's not possible. There is no provision for disciplining any field, but it's time, because the field is killing us.
It's time. I am with you. When I read the paper and having this conversation, there's so much commonality in everything you're saying, and I think a lot of us are really going to are going to feel this and follow it.
So, Sandy, what we're looking at here, like I showed you earlier, I showed you a very simplified depiction of the greenhouse gas crisis. This sort of steps back, adds detail, and gives you more context. And you can see where this begins. It begins at top left with economic overexpansion. The root cause of this entire crisis, greenhouse gas and other impacts, is the overexpansion of the capitalist economic system, especially after 1950. That led to an event that is still unrecognized largely in the intellectual community, in ecological overshoot. So economic expansion over several centuries led to ecological overshoot around 1950. And the two components of that overshoot condition, that crisis, are the GHG crisis we've been talking about and the various non-GHG impacts that you see there: habitat destruction, pollution, wastes, plastics, etc. But at the top, you can see the full picture of this greenhouse gas crisis, and you can see the linkages there. So you can see the unsafe concentrations lead initially, the warming side, to global warming. That leads to ocean warming. That leads, after a delay of about 20, 30 years, to change in the climate. There's also a direct link between global warming. About 7%, of the warming goes directly into the atmosphere. About 92, 93 goes into the ocean. And you can see that the warming of the ocean also causes ocean deoxygenation. So there's three effects on the ocean, okay? But you can see here even more explicitly that climate change at the very end of the causal sequence. It is not the crisis. The crisis is greenhouse gases. Climate change is simply one effect of the global warming branch of the greenhouse gas crisis. This to me is an important diagram. It's my depiction of the overall solution to the ecological crisis. So not just greenhouse gases, but the rest as well. So you can see on the left, I've got the GHG crisis there, and then below that, GHG impacts. So blue is greenhouse gas, purple is other stuff. And at the top, we're talking about our present damage. In other words, the damage we're doing with our current economic activities and other activities. And then the second over there is the past damage, the damage we've done over the past few centuries. And I won't go into the details here, but you can see here that each of these quadrants has a solution and a set of solutions. And I think that this is the only rational way to address this entire crisis, is to divide it into its greenhouse gas and non-greenhouse gas components, and then to address the ongoing damage from current economic activities, okay, mostly by reducing consumption and population and efficiencies, increasing. And the past damage, well, it depends on which it is. SRM and GGR for GHGs, and then ecological restoration, rewilding, etc. for non-greenhouse gas impacts. Now, other people may disagree with what I've put in these boxes, but I think this is the logical approach, so we don't miss anything, so we know what we're dealing with. So I base my rational response suggestion on this diagram here, and I think it's a good one that people should use and develop. I'll end there.
Frank, I think you've put forth a simple and easy to understand practical methodology. I don't see where it would go over anyone's head. This was well thought out, and you're definitely, your training skills show, and I appreciated it because you took me along and I learned. I liked it.
The final thing, should people be interested in the economics, which we have not discussed here, again, on my website, ecologicalsurvival.org, if you look at the menu, you'll find an entry for the economics of needs and limits. There is a link to a Kindle book or paperback. There's also a free PDF available if you can't afford $7 or $8. Okay, and my theory is laid out there. And like I said, it took 15 years of hard slogging to get there. It certainly isn't perfect, but I claim that it is a solid starting point for a new sustainable economic theory. And Sandy, if we're going to solve this crisis, we have to move beyond capitalism. And if we're going to move beyond capitalism, we need a theory to guide us. And the fact that I wrote this thing many years ago, I published my first book on this in 2007, 13 years ago. I have contacted numerous academics and progressives about it. Nobody gives a shit. Nobody cares.
Well, let's see if we can get somebody to give a shit, Frank.
Okay, that would be great. I'd love to hear any response that they have. I'm about to do a new version, a new edition. I'd love to hear some feedback.
I would like to provide it for you. Okay, Frank, this was very informative. It was really well done. Thank you. I followed your methodologies here and your reasoning, and it seems pretty straightforward to me. I hope we can get this out for you or help you. Any little bit of help is appreciated, I'm sure, because we're at a precipice. It's either we're going to go off the cliff like Thelma and Louise, or we're going to pull ourselves back by some, stroke of genius. So I want to thank you for being with me on Environmental Coffee House.
You're very welcome, Sandy. Hopefully we can do it again, okay?
Absolutely. Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye now.